back in commando mode. Because we're stalking bass again. In the middle of the night. I had great intentions of editing out this video when I shot it almost 5 years ago, but I never got around to doing it until now. And by now I've got 4 more years of raw video stored that I also don't have time to edit. Now, if you live in a city, which most people do, that's why cities are so big, and you want to go bass fishing, you'll often find that the lakes are crowded. There may be another bass fisherman already sitting on your spot, or a pack of otters, or there may be speedboats and jet skis tearing up the lake. You know, the wily bass do not want to get churned up like Dan Aykroyd's Bass-O-Matic, so they will often head to deeper water. But there's a way you can pretty much have this lake to yourself when it's glassy calm. You can sneak up on those big bass while they're roaming the shallows, prowling around for a live mouse, or a giant moth, or a baby bird that fell into the lake. Mateys, here's how.
Humpty's tip of the day. Go out at 2 o'clock in the morning. Humpty's tip of the day.
So I had to dispense with that eye patch there. For those of you who may not be familiar, I'm a fan of it's a SpongeBob called TV show. It's a reality TV show about marine ecology, and one of their characters in the show is Patchy the Pirate. So I was trying to do my Patchy the Pirate imitation, but I can't read my lines with that eye patch. So on with the show. If you remember from previous episodes, I proposed to get a bunch of bass fishermen together and climb up to the top of some big mountain somewhere that nobody's using, and we'd rename it as Mount Fishmore and carve it into the heads of 4 great heroes of topwater bass fishing. And the second hero I proposed was Fred Arbogast, who invented the amazing jitterbug lure. So we're going night fishing, and I want to warn you, again, don't blame me. If you go night fishing and something strange happens when you're out there on the water at night, it's pitch dark, and you're going to get harassed by beavers slapping, and you're going to get buzzed by owls and tangled up with bats, and you might run into penguins. So be prepared for the unorthodox, and that's what this show's about. So you're not likely to run into many people late at night, but the ones you do run into will not be normal. They'll either be dead drunk and racing around in an overpowered speedboat, or it could be even worse. They might be other bass fishermen. So let me tell you about this night on Quesnel Lake. This was a few nights after I shot the night fishing video that I showed in episode 6, and I was back out on Quesnel Lake throwing a jitterbug from my pontoon boat, and as it so happened on this hot summer night, I was trying to film my jitterbug wiggling along the surface under a bright full moon when I saw this light come out of the sky, and it disappeared behind the trees in the next channel. And then it was quiet for a little, maybe 15 minutes, and then I heard some splashing over there, and I thought I heard a guy, like a voice, say, "All hail Fred." Now, that's an odd thing to say, especially at 2 a.m., so I kind of snuck around the point and looked up to the next channel, and there was this guy in another pontoon boat, and there was enough moonlight that I could see him. He was releasing a nice bass, and I heard the splash when he threw it back in, and then again I heard him say, "All hail Fred." So I turned on my headlamp and puttered over to him, and we got to chatting, as fishermen do when they meet up on a lake. And he asked me where I was from, and I said, right here in Nanaimo. And I asked him where he was from, and it turns out he wasn't even from Van Isle. In fact, he wasn't even from planet Earth. He wasn't even from our solar system. He was from the planet Zircodon, way out in near the Crab Nebula. And so I asked him why he called the fish such a name, and he said, "No, no, I wasn't talking to the fish. I was talking to God." So it turns out that the people on Zircodon, I mean, he looked human, so I'll call them people. The people on Zircodon are crazy about bass fishing. They're very advanced with things like hyperspeed engines and death rays and space-time travel, but they were never very good at bass fishing. They just couldn't catch them. So one day they were cruising around the universe looking for some good bass lakes, and they intercepted some TV signals that were coming from a fishing show here on planet Earth, and the ads were selling jitterbug lures, selling these jitterbug lures. And so they came down here and they acquired a few jitterbugs from the Earthlings, shall we say, and this caused a little bit of commotion because they were seen doing it in those days. That was back when they still flew around in those saucer-shaped gizmos, and nowadays they use interstellar warp speed pontoon boats with ionic plasma linear accelerators. But I digress. Anyway, that's how they learned about jitterbugs. So it turned out this guy's name was Zorax, and apparently he has quite a reputation as a bass fisherman around the Crab Nebula. And he likes to come out to beautiful Van Isle every summer to enjoy the exciting midnight bass fishing that we're blessed with here. And he told me that the citizens of Zircodon, who were so advanced in so many ways, were getting very frustrated after thousands of years of hardly catching any big bass. But now they only fish at night and they only use these jitterbugs, and they catch lots. So the people of Zircodon were so impressed with the jitterbug that they made Fred Arbogast their supreme deity. They actually worship him, like the fountain of infinite knowledge or something. So whenever they catch and release a bass anywhere in the universe, they fold their hands in prayer and they say, "All hail Fred." So that's what he was doing when I met him. And I wanted to mention that because you'll hear me say it in this video too, and it's because I thought it would show my respect for the good citizens of Zircodon if I honored their god while Zorax was here. And besides, I kind of worship Fred Arbogast too. He sure invented a killer lure. So you can see me casting toward the full moon here. Now, in real life, that moon looks huge, and after your eyes adjust to it, you could probably read a newspaper by it. But that giant moon is just a tiny dot on film when you're using a GoPro. And it's quite spectacular to see a bass explode out of the deep and rip your lure off the surface, while all of this is silhouetted by a shining full moon. And that's what just happened. But you can't see anything until I get my headlamp turned on and then reach back to flip on the switch of the floodlight I've installed just for this moment. A nice July smallmouth on a jitterbug, and a shout out to the good people of Zircodon. Zorax had disappeared, always chasing that hot topwater bite, but I stayed in the same area and kept fishing. You can see my jitterbug skittering across the reflection of the moon, and pretty soon I got into another nice Dolomew. Again, it was a smashing surface hit silhouetted by a brilliant full moon. You'll have to take my word for it because you sure can't see that on the video. And this one's bigger and it's putting up more of a scrap. First, I have to get the fish under control enough to let go of the rod with my left hand and flick on my miner's headlamp. Then I grab the rod again with both hands to regain control of the fish. Hopefully. Then I let go again with my left hand and reach back into the dark to find the toggle switch for the floodlight that I've mounted on a pole. It's harder than it sounds, especially in the dark when you have a big angry bass thrashing and splashing around the boat. But all's well that ends well, and this ended with a slab, 19 inches to the fork of the tail. I find that most quenelle fish are on the skinny side, but some of the bigger ones are thick and deep. This one hasn't been going hungry lately. Quesnel Lake smallmouth are colored dark and spooky, like the water they live in. Every big old bass in this lake has probably been caught and released many times, and it probably knows the name and serial number of every popular lure on the shelf. After you release a good fish, it's always good to retie your knot. And you want to keep your own body strong too. So you can see me reach for the paper bag that contains my stash of vitamin D. And then for my thermos, which is full of steaming hot vitamin C. Coffee and donuts. If you maintain a healthy intake of those two essential vitamins, you can fish all night long. I got a few more hits that night, but I didn't catch anything memorable, so I gave up early and headed back to the boat launch before dawn. And I ran into Zorax again, so I asked him to come to shore and say a few words for the fans of the Basstravaganza. Hello, would you like to introduce yourself to the people of planet Earth? I understand that you're quite a legend around the Crab Nebula, and you catch a lot of big bass. Is it true they call you Zorax the Magnificent? Well then, do you have any advice for the bass fishermen here in Canada? Thank you. I'd like to present you with this Canadian flag as a token of friendship between the people of Canada and the people of Zircodon. All hail Fred. Tell me, Zorax, do you have any advice for the people of planet Earth? So there is something you won't see on any of those other fishing shows. As far as I know, this is the first time any fishing show has ever had an interview with a real live extraterrestrial. So now I'm back a couple nights later, but tonight I'm out on Shawnigan Lake in the mighty Bullship. It's still almost full moon, but you can see that there's a little bit of wind and a ripple on the water. This is a buzzkill because the jitterbug doesn't work unless the surface is glassy calm. Owls, penguins, and ETs. Just when you think it can't get any weirder, you run into something even more frightening. Actually, I'm just giving him a hard time. This happens to be my friend Mike, who was also my professor and the creator of the environmental technology program at Camosun College in Victoria, where I was one of his students. I managed to talk him into going out night fishing with me, and he was foolish enough to come along. Now, if you've ever met him, you'll realize that Mike often claims to have caught many a bass in the past. But this may be the first time ever that there's actual proof of him doing it. After Mike wimped out and went home, the lake went dead and I couldn't get another bite on my jitterbug. This often happens in summer, and I don't know why. Tonight, though, the wily bass just didn't seem to want to bite on my jitterbug at all. I've done a number of previous episodes showing topwater fishing with my homemade lures. And I discussed how they were modeled on the historic Zara spook lure, and how I started making my own imitations and modifying them to look more realistic by adding tails made out of alumisol. So I thought, if the bass won't bite on a jitterbug near shore, what if I throw one of my homemade topwater minnow imitation lures way out over deep water? Instead of throwing a mouse imitation into the darkest spots and triggering to fish to bite at the sound it makes on the surface, what if I threw one of these realistic minnow imitations right out into the middle of the lake in bright moonlight where they can get a good look at it? Well, what happened was that my topwater lures got bit when the store-bought jitterbugs did not. Well, there you have it, folks. E.T., Mike Corey, and my first ever midnight bass caught on a homemade lure. Welcome to the Basstravaganza. It's not the biggest bass in the world, but it's a milestone for Humpty. This is my first Zara fluke lure. It's like a Zara spook with flared gills, so I call it a Zara fluke. You can see the alumisol tail wiggling like a live fish, and I can imagine the wily bass watching that wiggly tail silhouetted in the full moon And I like to think that's what triggered the fish to bite. Well, like Patchy the Pirate in SpongeBob says, "We're burning moonlight, matey!" And we'd better get back to fishing while it's still dark. It didn't end there. After I missed a couple more hits, it slowed down, so I found a calm spot and did the exact opposite of what I normally do at night, which is throw a jitterbug close to shore in the darkest spot and keep crawling it back toward the boat. Instead, I threw my big wiggly homemade lure way out into the middle of the lake, as far as I could throw it, out over maybe 15, 20 feet deep of water. And this time I didn't retrieve it at all. I just let it float there on the surface and laid the rod across the boat and opened up my thermos and sipped the last of my vitamin C, and I just imagined that Alumisol tail wiggling ever so gently under that shining moon. And I imagined a giant smallmouth nosing under it and checking it out and watching that tail fin wiggle in the moonlight. But I finally gave up. My fantasy just wasn't going to happen that night. So after a couple of minutes, I gave up and went to pick up my rod. But before I could touch the rod, a huge vortex appeared in the moonlight where my lure had been, like somebody dropped a piano into the water. You tubers out there in tubeland can't imagine the shock and awe of a smashing topwater hit on a mirror calm lake under a full moon. You just can't capture it on GoPro. You have to be there. So I grabbed my rod and reeled in another nice bass, proudly wearing my homemade lure, made out of super cypress cedar, with the single triple hook in the corner of its jaw. Well, all good nights come to an end, and pretty soon the eastern shoreline was silhouetted by the rising sun. On the way back to the boat launch, I got into another nice fish on a similar homemade lure, only this one was a rainbow trout pattern. But my GoPro battery was dead, so I had to change out to another one before I could shoot this little segment. Now, bass are tough fish, and it doesn't bother them to be out of the water for a few seconds while I pose them for the camera, but don't ever do this to a trout. Now it's time to head back out into the lake and tell all your wily bass buddies about the delicious flavor of super cypress cedar. So I learned something that night. With all due respect to the good people on the planet Zircodon, you don't have to use jitterbugs to catch bass after dark. And you don't have to use store-bought lures. After decades of fishing for bass, these were the first ones I ever caught on any topwater lure other than a jitterbug at night, and also the first bass I ever caught at night on a homemade lure. And that inspired me to start developing my own midnight lures. I'll get around to the ongoing evolution of my spook imitation topwater lures in some future episode. But now let's return to the jitterbug, because that's what this episode was supposed to be about. They catch lots of fish, but they have a few drawbacks to me. First, they're tiny and light, and that means you can't throw them very far. And they also come with two small triple hooks, so it often happens that one will stick in the fish's jaw and the other will snag in the fish's belly or its eyeball or its gut while the fish is thrashing around. And I hate that. So I use only one triple hook, even if it means I catch less fish. Another problem with the store-bought jitterbugs is that these little triple hooks are made out of fine wire. So they're basically useless with heavy line. Anything heavier than 8-pound test, and you'll just straighten out the hooks if there's a snag or a big fish on the other end. So if you use heavier line, you need to back off on your drag, which means you can't stop a big fish from diving under a dock or into a weed bed. And if you can't stop them, they'll wrap around something and break off the line, and then you have to buy another lure, which means a whole lot of new lures sold by the faceless multinational corporation that bought out the rights to sell these jitterbugs. But it also means that a lot of trophy bass end up swimming off with a huge lure and a mess of triple hooks stuck in their throat. And I don't like that either, so I use heavy line and big strong hooks. I never break off a lure. Never. Now back east, where they have giant muskies, you can buy big jitterbugs in stores, and they call it the musky size. But here on Van Isle, you can hardly find a store anywhere that even sells jitterbugs, and if they do, they only sell this standard size here. Now, my feeling is that if you're going to bother staying up all night to go out fishing at 2 o'clock in the morning, why fish for dinkers? You can catch dinkers all day long. So if you go out at night, why not be a man, not a wimp? And use a man's lure, not a wimp's lure. So of course I started thinking about making a bigger one.
So we're trying to replicate the work of great genius Fred Arbogast, who invented, this is the original jitterbug lure, invented by Fred Arbogast long ago, kind that I used for decades. And Fred Arbogast, whose head will soon be carved up onto top of one of the great mountains in the Rocky Mountain chain, if the Basstravaganza has anything to say about it. So I used these little jitterbugs for ages, and a couple of years ago I was in Duncan at Bucky's fishing tackle shop. I was having a root canal actually, and in between root canal sessions I went in, just down the street was Bucky's fishing store, and they had these giant jitterbugs that were kind of like this, about this size, and this is the body of it. So I bought one. They were $5. I bought one and it was too big, so I chopped out, I sawed out, saw the body off, and I took about 1.5 inches out of the body and glued the tail back in and came up with this real warty, lumpy shape. Here's a giant jitterbug. I bought it in Duncan. It was about this long. I chopped a piece of it off, fitted the tail back in there so it's smaller now. Put a triple hook in here. It had about 8 triple hooks hanging out of it.
You don't have to be a great artist to paint a jitterbug. They're like the old Model T Fords. You can use any color you like as long as it's black.
They can't see these eyes. Why do they put those eyes in there? No way the fish can see that. That's for the fishermen.
And you don't have to worry about the top half of the lure because the fish can't see that. They're looking from bottom up. And I replaced the original. You can see it came with a whole bunch of triple hooks hanging off, and I replaced it with just a single triple hook, and I was getting tons of hits but very few hookups. So I headed up to Spider Lake, which can be a really difficult spot to get topwater hits at midnight. And this right here is the very first trial run of the modified Bucky Bug. Now this night I didn't have my floodlight with me, so I had to rely on my miner's headlamp. But that is one nice fat bass posing for the Basstravaganza with that ginormous Bucky Bug hanging out of its mouth. Look at the fat gut on this fish. Who says bass don't eat much in the middle of summer? I'll tell you who. It's the same people that throw rubber worms in daylight over the same spots where they caught so many bass during the May spawning season. But with all due respect to the good people of Zircodon, all hail Bucky! Well, now I know that giant Bucky Bug gets bit, so I had to head back to Shawnigan the next night. There's another full moon shimmering over the ripples of a slight breeze, so I need to scout around for calm water. But I finally found it. And here you can see the ripples of the Bucky Bug jittering across the moon's reflection. Here you can see me giving a demo of the Bucky Bug. It almost fills up my hand, and a fish will have to hit it at exactly the right spot to have a chance to get the hook into its mouth. There's a reason the fish I'm targeting are called smallmouth. It's hard to fit all that wood and metal into a small mouth of a smallmouth bass, but that doesn't mean they won't try. And bingo, I get hit right away. It's hard to believe that this little dinker would dare to attack something as big as the buckybug, much less get the hook into its mouth. Well, let's try again. Another dark, shady, calm spot, and another dinker. The bite is on tonight, even if the fish are small so far. But this one is no dinker. It's a Shawnigan fatso with a mouthful of cabbage weeds, wearing the buckybug with pride. One quick flip of the needle-nose pliers, and the fish is back in the water, bragging to its friends about being a movie star. And they keep getting bigger as the night goes on. These are the kind of fish that make it worth going out at 2 in the morning. And when you consider that I'm missing 4 or 5 big surface hits for every one that I'm getting into the boat, you can get an idea of the frenzy that can occur when you get out into the middle of one of these midsummer topwater bites. Tonight they all want a piece of that buckybug, and I'm happy to keep throwing it out there for them to chew on. If you're careful, you can catch and release these slab smallmouth 100 times, and they'll still live happily ever after. Very different from trout or steelhead. Always have your needle-nose pliers handy. It's very easy to lose things in a boat at night. Never lose your pliers or the fish will suffer for it. This one is rambunctious, and it keeps trying to tangle me in my own prop, so I have to keep reaching over the camera mount to keep control, while the fish tries to pull me into the branches along shore. It's hard enough with a big fish in daylight, but it's way harder at night, and a lot of them get away in the process. But I think you make up for that because on some nights you get way more hits at night. You can afford to miss a few, or even a dozen, before you finally get a good fish into the net. This is another resident from the regional district of Dinkerland. Not really one I'm after, but when you first hear the splashy hit, they all sound like giants. Is there time for another one? You bet. And this is the biggest and fattest one yet. If I can get it into the net, I'm going to lay it on the seat and measure it.
Yes, sir.
Again, never do this with a trout or a steelhead if you're not planning to kill it and eat it. You scrape away the slime and tiny scales off of their skin. Bass are armor-plated, 19.5 inches to the fork of the tail. If the folks on Zircodon find out about this, they might decide to get a new god and start worshiping Bucky. Well, that buckybug didn't have a long lifespan. It started out getting pounded, but as time went on, it was getting less and less hits, and finally I could tell that it just didn't sound right. And when I first used it, it made a loud gurgling noise, but now it hardly made any noise at all. So I checked it out in daylight, and I found out why. After the sloppy job I did, cutting up and rebuilding the lure, it wasn't watertight anymore, and it started leaking as soon as it touched the water. And even the tiniest bit of water inside the lure killed the action and the sound. It had totally lost its mojo. It couldn't do the jitterbug anymore. And if your jitterbug can't dance, none of those big old bass will want to come up out of the deep and dance with it. I could have patched the holes and gone on fishing with it, but I had a better idea. By this point, I'd already proved that the wily bass can be fooled into grabbing a topwater minnow imitation lure off the surface under a full moon, if that lure is made out of super cyper cedar.
Super cyper cedar.
What if I replaced the hollow plastic body of the buckybug with a solid piece of super cyper cedar? First off, it would be unsinkable. Second, I don't know if I ever mentioned this, but super cyper cedar has special chemical properties that make it almost irresistible to bass. So they could smell it even if they couldn't see it or hear it.
Aroma or
So that's what this episode was supposed to be about, along with my theory that it doesn't make a hoot of difference what you paint onto the top half of a jitterbug, because the fish can't see it. They're always looking at it from the bottom. But again, I'm going back years in time here, but I have to show this part first, because We have to understand the past before we can hope to understand the present or dream about designing new lures for the future. But you can see where this is all going, and you can imagine what you'll get in some future episode if I ever get around to editing it out.
Super Cyper Cedar.
But again, I digress. If you remember in episode 3, I suggested that we carve the heads of the 4 great heroes who invented the 4 greatest topwater bass lures into Mount Fishmore. And I showed the 4 great lures, and I've already selected the first 2 heroes, Grover Cox and Fred Arbogast. Topwater lure number 3 is the one commonly called the Rapala or the Rapala, produced and sold by the company founded by Laurie Rapala. And I had always understood that it was Laurie himself who invented the lure that now bears his name. And since I've not had a lot of support yet for my plan to carve giant heads into Mount Fishmore, basically because Canadian bass fishermen are a bunch of wimps, I didn't know what to do. So, we had a little bit of snow here last month, and I had to get my car out of the driveway. So I decided to kill 2 stones with one bird and build my own Mount Fishmore. And that way I could get some practice carving Laurie Rapala's head into it, was my plan. So I went sleuthing around the interweb looking for a picture of Laurie Rapala that I could use as a model for the mountain that I just built. And I was shocked to discover this web link and learn the rest of the story. It turns out that it was another Finnish trout fisherman, this Toivo Pilvalainen, and who actually invented this lure. And Laurie Rapala talked him out of his secrets, and apparently he made Laurie Rapala sign a document that's still on file somewhere in Finland, stating that he would never spread the word or market those lures. And Toivo went on to live out the rest of his life as a hermit on an island in a lake, and Laurie went on to mass produce these lures and sell enough of them to build up what is now the biggest fishing tackle multinational corporation the world has ever known. Now, here at the Basstravaganza, we honor the people who invented the lures, not just the people who made the most money off them. So Laurie Rapala has officially been booted off Mount Fishmore, and his spot is replaced by the head of our next great hero, Toivo Pilvalainen.
All hail Fred.
All hail Toivo!